In the quiet luxury of a mansion, a woman the world believed dead tries to live unseen, but a lost necklace, watchful eyes, and buried secrets threatened to pull her out of the past she swore to forget. And when the truth comes to light, nothing in that living room will ever be the same. The January afternoon hung heavy and humid over the majestic brownstone mansion perched in the hills of Boston. The thick air carried the sweet scent of flowering apple trees, mixed with the refined perfume of the lilies, adorning the perfectly manicured gardens. In the main hall, where colonial stained-glass windows filtered the golden afternoon light, the elegant murmur of guests intertwined with the crystalline clinking of bohemian crystal glasses. Alison Miller, 26, moved in the shadows of the imposing marble columns with the silent grace of someone who had learned to become invisible. Her pale skin contrasted with the impeccable black uniform she wore, while her green eyes, the color of Montana emeralds, observed every detail with an intensity few noticed. Her hands, now soft from domestic work, had once held weapons heavier than the silver trays she now carried. Few knew that the name Alison Miller was as fake as her supposed story of a humble housekeeper from a small town in Maine. The true identity of that woman was buried in classified military files, marked with the red stamp that meant killed in action. She had chosen to die to the official world 3 years ago, after an operation that had cost her everything: her unit, her comrades, her faith in justice, and her ability to trust anyone. She now worked in the mansion of David Thompson, 32, heir to a fortune built on steel and oil empires, whose businesses stretched from Chicago to New York. David was a man of contrasts. His fair skin held a hint of the American sun that bathed his lands, while his blue eyes, inherited from a great-great-grandmother from the East Coast, seemed capable of seeing through any facade. Tall, broad-shouldered, and with a magnetic presence, he possessed that natural elegance that only came from years of privilege, but also a hardness in his gaze that spoke of battles fought in boardrooms and difficult decisions made in solitude. The mansion, an architectural jewel that had belonged to the Thompson family for 4 generations, was the perfect setting for the social events David organized monthly. That afternoon, as the last sunbeams painted the brownstone walls gold, a charity reception was being held for the board of a children's hospital. Among the guests were the cream of Boston society: entrepreneurs, politicians, artists, and the kind of people who measured their importance by the number of zeros in their bank accounts. Alison had been working there for 8 months, enough time to know every corner of the house, every routine of her boss, every secret the walls seemed to hold. She had grown accustomed to the rhythm of the mansion, the quiet mornings when David worked in his study, the afternoons of business meetings in the library, the lonely nights when he walked through the gardens, as if searching for something he never found. But this afternoon would be different. While serving French champagne in cut crystal glasses, Alison felt someone watching her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. Looking up, her green eyes met the penetrating gaze of an elegant, middle-aged woman with perfectly coiffed platinum blonde hair, dressed in a Chanel suit that probably cost more than a housekeeper's annual salary. "You," the woman said in a syrupy voice laced with venom, her accent revealing European origins. "That gold bracelet you're wearing, don't you think it's a bit above your station?" Silence spread like an oil slick. Alison felt all eyes turn to her wrist, where she was indeed wearing a thin gold bracelet, the only thing she had left from her previous life, a gift from her mother before she died. Conversations gradually stopped, creating a circle of morbid curiosity around the scene. "Pardon me, ma'am, I didn't— Do housekeepers wear gold jewelry now?" the woman continued, raising her voice just enough for everyone to hear. "Or do you have other ways of getting money?" The air seemed to thicken. Alison felt her cheeks burn as stifled giggles began to surface among the guests. Some looked away uncomfortably, others watched with the morbid curiosity of someone witnessing a car accident. This was Evelyn Carter, Alison remembered bitterly, the wife of a textile mogul, known for her viper's tongue and her fondness for humiliating those she considered inferior. "Ma'am, this bracelet belonged to my mother. It's the only thing that—" "How convenient," Evelyn interrupted with a cruel smile. "They always have a touching story ready, don't they?" David, who had been in conversation with the mayor near the French windows leading to the garden, approached upon hearing the confrontational tone. His presence commanded immediate respect. He had that kind of silent authority that made people straighten up involuntarily when he entered a room. "Is there a problem?" he asked in a calm but firm voice, his blue eyes moving between Evelyn and Alison, just pointing out an inconsistency. Evelyn replied with false sweetness. It's odd to see a housekeeper with gold jewelry, don't you think? For a moment that seemed eternal, David's eyes fixed on Alison. She held her head high, though inside she was crumbling. She had survived military operations, ambushes, the loss of her comrades, but this public humiliation was destroying her in a way bullets never had. "Evelyn," David said finally, his voice cutting through the air like a sharp blade, "I think it would be prudent for you to mind your own business instead of inventing drama where there is none." But the damage was already done. Alison felt the weight of the gazes, some compassionate, others accusatory, all of them classifying her, labeling her, reducing her to a stereotype. In that moment, the woman who had once commanded soldiers, who had risked her life for her country, who had sacrificed everything for an ideal of justice, felt smaller than she ever had. With the tray trembling barely perceptibly in her hands, Alison retreated to the kitchen, where she was met by Martha Jones, the head cook, a robust 58-year-old woman with agile hands and a heart of gold who had raised 5 children as a single mother. "Don't you pay them any mind, honey," Martha whispered, taking her arm with maternal affection. "That woman's heart is as black as the coffee she wouldn't know how to make." But Alison barely heard the comforting words. In her mind echoed the mocking giggles, the scornful looks, the humiliation that had been seared into her memory. She unconsciously touched the gold bracelet, remembering the day her mother had given it to her with tears in her eyes, saying, "So you never forget who you are, my love, no matter where life takes you." That night, as the mansion returned to its tranquility after the last guest had left, Alison was in her small room in the servants' quarters, looking out the window at the gardens lit by the full moon. The tears she had held back all afternoon finally found their way down her cheeks. She had been wrong to think she could start over. She had been wrong to believe she could build a quiet life away from her past. But most of all, she had been wrong to think she could belong to a world that saw her as invisible until it needed a target for its cruelty. In the distance, she could see David's silhouette walking the gravel paths among the roses, his hands in his pockets, his head slightly bowed as if lost in deep thought. For a moment, their paths had crossed when he defended her, but she knew it was just courtesy. A man like him could never understand what it meant to be judged for a gold bracelet when your entire former identity had been erased. The months that followed that humiliating evening brought subtle but significant changes to the mansion's dynamic. Alison became even more careful, more silent, more invisible. She had learned to walk the hallways like a ghost, to anticipate the needs of the house before they were expressed, to become indispensable precisely because of her ability to go unnoticed. But David began to notice her in ways he hadn't before, small gestures, casual observations that revealed an intelligence that didn't fit the profile of a rural housekeeper, the way she organized the newspapers, not just by date, but by the importance of the news, how she instinctively knew when he needed silence and when he required the discreet presence of someone nearby, the way her eyes moved through the rooms, not like someone cleaning, but like someone strategically evaluating every space. One day in March, while organizing books in the library, a room with high ceilings and mahogany shelves that stretched from floor to ceiling, Alison couldn't help but stop at a volume on American military history. Her fingers caressed the cover with a nostalgia she thought she had buried. "Are you interested in military history?" David's deep voice startled her. He had entered silently, as was his habit. Alison tensed, aware that she had let her guard down. "No, sir. I was just tidying up." "That particular book is about U.S. Army Special Operations in the last decade," he continued, approaching where she stood. "It's pretty specific material, not casual reading." Alison felt the danger. Every instinct trained in years of covert operations screamed at her that she had made a mistake, that she had revealed too much. "I wouldn't know, sir. I've also noticed that when official visitors arrive, you have a particular way of observing the surroundings, as if you're evaluating potential threats." The silence that followed was dense, loaded with unasked questions and answers that couldn't be given. Alison kept her gaze fixed on the book, her knuckles white from how tightly she was holding it. "Is there something you'd like to tell me, Alison?" That question, asked with a gentleness she hadn't expected, almost broke down her defenses. For a moment, she was tempted to tell him everything, who she had been, what she had lost, why she was hiding in her own life. But fear was stronger. "No, sir, there's nothing to tell." David studied her for another moment, his blue eyes seeming to search for a crack in her facade. He finally nodded, but Alison knew he hadn't believed a word. That night, alone in her room, she faced an uncomfortable truth. For the first time in 3 years, Someone was actually seeing her, not as an invisible employee, not as a military target, but as a person with mysteries to be solved, and that terrified her more than any enemy she had faced in the past. Chapter 2. The weeks following the encounter in the library were characterized by a subtle but constant tension that permeated every interaction between Allison and David. He had begun to find excuses to be in the same rooms where she was working, and she had developed a sixth sense for detecting his presence before he appeared. One April morning, as the spring breeze moved the white linen curtains in the main living room, Allison was polishing the silver frames of family photographs when her eyes stopped on a particular image. It was David, but younger, dressed in a military uniform, standing next to a group of officers. His expression was serious, mature beyond his years, and there was something in his eyes that she recognized, the look of someone who had seen too much. "Mandatory military service," said a voice behind her. Allison jumped, but this time not because David had caught her off guard, but because she had been so absorbed in the photograph that her usual defenses had dropped. "Pardon me, sir. I didn't mean to." "It's okay, I was a lieutenant. 2 years of service in border security operations," he continued, approaching to look at the photograph with her. "It wasn't exactly what my father had planned for my business education." For the first time, Allison detected something vulnerable in his voice, a small crack in the armor of perfection he always seemed to wear. "Did you like it?" she asked without thinking, and immediately regretted the familiarity of the question. David looked at her with surprise, as if he hadn't expected her to show personal interest in his life. "More than I should have," he answered honestly. "There was something about the simplicity of clear orders, of knowing exactly what your mission was and how to accomplish it. In the corporate world, the lines are never so clear." Allison felt a recognition that made her uncomfortable. There was something in the way he spoke about military service that resonated with her own experience, but she couldn't allow herself that connection. It must have been hard to come back to. "This," she murmured, gesturing subtly toward the opulence that surrounded them. "Why do you say that?" The question took her by surprise. She had revealed too much again, had shown an understanding that a rural housekeeper shouldn't have. I guess any big change must be difficult." David studied her with that intensity she was now familiar with, as if trying to solve a particularly complex puzzle. "Sometimes I think you follow orders better than a lot of soldiers I knew," he commented casually. "You have that way of always being alert, of processing information before acting." Allison's heart raced. He was getting too close to the truth. "I just try to do my job well, sir." "Have you ever thought about doing something more?" he asked. "You clearly have more capabilities than this position requires." It was a dangerous question, loaded with implications. Allison felt the impulse to flee, to find an excuse to get out of a conversation that was becoming too personal. "This job suits me, sir. I'm not looking for complications." The word complications hung in the air between them, charged with multiple meanings. David nodded slowly, but his eyes remained fixed on her with an intensity that made her feel exposed. That afternoon, while Allison was working in the garden, helping old Mr. Roberts, the head gardener, a thin 70-year-old man with gnarled but expert hands, an unexpected visitor arrived. A middle-aged man with graying hair and an unmistakable military bearing stepped out of an official car with government plates. Allison felt her blood run cold. She would recognize that silhouette anywhere. It was Colonel James Miller, her former commanding officer, the man who had officially declared her dead 3 years ago. What was he doing here? With her heart pounding in her chest, she managed to hide behind the rose bushes while watching Miller head toward the main entrance. Mr. Roberts, who was pruning the lilies nearby, looked at her curiously. "You okay, honey? You look pale. Just need a little water," she murmured, trying to keep her voice steady. She spent the next hour in a state of controlled panic, waiting at any moment to hear her real name shouted throughout the mansion, waiting for her carefully constructed new life to fall apart. But Colonel Miller left after a 2-hour meeting with David, without having seen her. That night she couldn't help but wonder what the purpose of that visit had been. Was it a coincidence, or had she somehow been discovered? The paranoid thoughts she had learned to control came back with renewed force. The next day during breakfast, David casually mentioned to Martha, "Colonel Miller came by yesterday to discuss a security project for our manufacturing plants. He's concerned about some threats that similar companies to ours have received." Allison, who was serving coffee, felt relief and terror at the same time. On one hand, the visit had nothing to do with her. On the other, the proximity of her past had left her deeply shaken. "Is everything all right?" David asked, noticing her slightly trembling hand as she poured his coffee. "Yes, sir. I just didn't sleep well last night." But David had noticed something else. He had seen how she reacted when he mentioned Colonel Miller. a reaction that went beyond casual curiosity about her boss's affairs. The days that followed brought a series of small incidents that began to weave a disturbing pattern. First, a new gardener was hired without Martha, who usually handled all the service staff hiring. Knowing anything about it, the man, who called himself Jack Thompson, had eyes that were too alert for someone who was supposed to be dedicated only to pruning bushes. Second, Allison began to notice that her things had been subtly moved in her room. Nothing had been stolen, but the specific order in which she left her few belongings had been altered by expert hands that knew how to search without appearing to. Third, and most alarming, she discovered that her daily routine was being observed. While walking through the local market on her day off, she saw at least 2 people who seemed to be following her at a safe distance, changing direction when she did, stopping when she stopped. The paranoia that had been her constant companion during her years of military service returned with full force. Someone was looking for her, and they were getting closer. But who, and why now? One May afternoon, while cleaning David's office, she accidentally found an open folder on his desk. What she saw made her feel as if the ground were opening up beneath her feet. It was a background investigation report, and on the first page was her photograph, not the current one, but one from her military days, along with the name Lieutenant Emily Morales, her real name, her real rank. David knew who she was. With trembling hands, she closed the folder and left the office as silently as she had entered. Her mind raced. How long had he known? Was that why he had hired her? Was he working with someone from the government? With her former commanding officer? That night, Allison, or Emily, as she had been called in her previous life, sat on the edge of her bed, facing a decision she had been postponing for months. She could run away that very night, disappear again, build a new identity somewhere else, or she could stay and face the consequences, whatever they might be. As she contemplated her options, she remembered something her mother used to tell her as a child. "Honey, you can run from many things, but you can never run from yourself. And sometimes the person you're running from most is who you could become." For the first time in 3 years, Emily allowed herself to remember who she had been before everything fell apart. A strong, courageous woman who had risked everything for her principles. A woman who deserved to be seen, known, loved for who she really was, not for the mask she had learned to wear. Maybe it was time to stop running. The decision slowly took shape in her mind as the moon rose over the mansion's gardens. She wouldn't run away tonight, but she also wouldn't continue living in the shadows. If David knew the truth, then the time had come to face it head-on. The next day, as he worked in his study, Emily knocked on the door with a determination she hadn't felt in years. "Come in." She entered and closed the door behind her, her heart beating like a war drum. "Mr. Thompson, I think we need to talk." David looked up from his documents, and for the first time since she had known him, Emily saw something akin to relief cross his blue eyes. "Yes," he said simply, "I think we do." But before they could exchange another word, the sound of vehicles approaching up the driveway broke the moment. David went to the window, and his expression hardened. "Emily," he said, using her real name for the first time, "I think we have company." 3 black vehicles with tinted windows were stopping in front of the mansion, and from the first one stepped Colonel Miller, this time with what appeared to be a full squad. Her past had finally caught up with her. Chapter 3. Time seemed to stand still as Emily watched the vehicles line up in front of the mansion, like chess pieces in a deadly game. Colonel Miller walked with that military authority she knew so well, flanked by 6 men who were clearly not regular soldiers. Their movements, their posture, the way their eyes scanned the surroundings, everything screamed special forces. "Do you know why they're here?" David asked, his voice controlled but tense. Emily felt the weight of 3 years of lies and half-truths pressing against her chest like a concrete slab. "They're coming for me," she responded, her voice barely a whisper. "I always knew this day would come." David turned to her, and for the first time since she had known him, she saw something akin to vulnerability in his blue eyes. "How long have you known who I am?" she asked before he could speak. 3 months, he admitted, "since I found this." He opened the top drawer of his desk and pulled out a small military dog tag. It was the same one Emily had lost the day she arrived to work at the mansion, the one she thought had fallen somewhere in the garden. "Lieutenant Emily Morales, U.S. Army Special Forces, Covert Operations Unit," he recited from memory. "Officially killed in action during Operation Midnight Storm 3 years ago. Unofficially, the sole survivor of a unit that was betrayed from within." The sound of footsteps approaching down the main hallway interrupted the conversation. Martha appeared at the door, her face pale with worry. "Mr. Thompson, there are some military men who insist on speaking with you. They say it's urgent." Tell them I'm in an important meeting and that I'll meet them in the main living room in 5 minutes, David replied, without taking his eyes off Emily. When Martha left, he continued, the question is, are you going to keep running or are you finally going to trust someone? Emily felt something break inside her. 3 years of solitude, of constant fear, of living like a ghost of herself, all crumbled in that moment. You don't know what you're asking, she said, her voice trembling. You don't know what I'm running from. My unit was sent on a mission that turned out to be a trap. 5 of my comrades died because someone in the upper echelons sold our location. I only survived because I was a coward. A coward? David's expression hardened. Would a coward have risked her life to pull 2 wounded soldiers out of a combat zone? Would a coward have endured 3 days of interrogation to protect classified information? Would a coward have refused federal protection so as not to put other people in danger? Emily looked at him in shock. How did he know all that? I read your entire file, Emily. Not the official one, which is full of convenient lies, but the real one. The one that documents how a 23-year-old lieutenant became the nightmare of 3 different cartels, how she dismantled a network of corruption that reached the highest levels of the government, and how she paid the price for doing the right thing. The tears she had been holding back for years finally found their way down Emily's cheeks. They died because of me, she whispered. If I had seen the trap, if I had been more careful. They died because someone betrayed them, David corrected her firmly. And that someone is out there, waiting to finish what they started. The footsteps in the hallway became more audible. Time was running out. Why? Emily asked. Why are you helping me? Why are you risking all this? David approached her, his blue eyes fixed on her green ones with an intensity that made her feel as if he could see into her soul. Because I recognize someone who is as lost as I am, he said softly. Because I've spent the last 8 months watching an extraordinary woman pretend to be invisible, and because I fell in love with both versions of you. Before Emily could fully process his words, the study door opened uninvited. Colonel Miller entered, followed by 2 of his men. David, he greeted with familiarity, I apologize for the intrusion, but we have an urgent matter to discuss. His eyes moved to Emily, and she saw the exact moment he recognized her. A cold smile curled his lips. Lieutenant Morales, he said in a cordial tone that didn't reach his eyes. How interesting to find you here. Colonel, she replied, straightening up to her full military posture for the first time in 3 years. Are you 2 know each other? David asked in a carefully neutral tone. Oh yes, Miller replied. Lieutenant Morales and I have history. In fact, I came here precisely to collect her. Collect her? David subtly stepped between Miller and Emily. I don't understand. Miss Miller is an employee in my household. Miller? Miller laughed without humor. How creative. Though I suppose after 3 years of living a lie, deception becomes second nature. The tension in the room was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Emily knew they had reached the point of no return. What do you want, Colonel? She asked directly. To finish what we started 3 years ago, he replied. You see, David, your housekeeper is actually a fugitive. She deserted a crucial mission and has been evading military justice ever since. That's a lie, David intervened, his voice sharp as steel. And you know it. Miller studied David with new attention. I see you've been doing your own research. Impressive. But I'm afraid this is a matter of national security that is above your corporate influence. Emily felt the familiar moment when all options narrowed to a single one, fight. But this time, for the first time in 3 years, she wasn't alone. Colonel, David said, his voice taking on a tone Emily had never heard, one that spoke of real power and connections that went beyond money. I believe you've made a mistake by coming here without official orders, because this meeting is being recorded, and I have a feeling there are several people in Washington, D.C. who would be very interested in hearing this conversation. Miller's expression subtly changed. For the first time, he seemed less sure. I don't know what you're talking about. I'm talking about General Thompson, my uncle, who happens to be the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. I'm talking about the files that document how you sold information about Operation Midnight Storm to a drug cartel. I'm talking about the wire transfers to accounts in the Cayman Islands that we can trace directly to you. The silence that followed was deafening. Emily looked at David with a mix of awe and terror. What had he gotten himself into because of her? You have 5 minutes to get off my property, David continued, or I'll make a call that will end your career and send you straight to a military prison where traitors get exactly what they deserve. Miller looked between David and Emily, calculating his options. Finally, a cruel smile crossed his face. This isn't over, he said, addressing Emily specifically. You can run, you can hide, you can even find rich princes to protect you. But someday, when you least expect it, I'll finish what I started." With that, he and his men retreated, leaving David and Emily alone in the study. The silence stretched between them until Emily finally spoke. "Is your uncle really the commander-in-chief?" "My father's brother, yes," David confirmed, "though I rarely brag about family connections." "I don't understand why you're doing this," she said, her voice breaking. "Now you're in danger too. Everything you've built, your family, your company, it's all at risk because of me." David approached her, gently lifting her chin so she would look him in the eyes. "Remember what I told you before? I fell in love with both versions of you. With Allison, the woman who found peace tending gardens and serving coffee, and with Emily, the soldier who risked everything to do the right thing. I'm not going to let you face this alone." For the first time in years, Emily allowed herself to truly see the man in front of her. Not as her boss, not as someone from another social world, but as David. A man who had risked everything for a woman he didn't even know if she could love him back. "What if I can't be what you need?" she whispered. "What if I'm too broken to be loved?" "Then we'll learn how to heal the broken parts together," he replied, taking her face in his hands. "But first, I need you to promise me something." "What?" "That you won't run again. No matter what happens, we'll face this together." Emily felt something she hadn't experienced in 3 years. Real hope. Not the desperate hope of surviving one more day, but the hope that maybe, just maybe, she could have a life worth living. "I promise," she said, and for the first time since she had arrived at that mansion, she wasn't lying. But as they sealed that promise with their first kiss, a kiss that tasted of American coffee and an uncertain but possibility-filled future, neither of them saw the figure watching them from the gardens. Jack Thompson, the gardener who had been hired without Martha's knowledge, was speaking quietly into a cell phone. "I confirm the target is in place." "Yes, sir. I also confirm she has protection. The plan will need to be adjusted." The war for Emily's future had just begun. Chapter 4. The days that followed the confrontation with Colonel Miller brought a tense calm reminiscent of those moments before a tropical storm hits. The mansion, which had always been a refuge of tranquility, now felt like a fortress under siege. Emily had reclaimed her real name, but with it had also come the full weight of her past. David had discreetly increased the property's security. New guards patrolled the perimeters. Camera systems were installed at strategic points, and a team of security experts, recommended by his uncle, the general, conducted daily sweeps for listening devices. But the most significant change was in the dynamic between David and Emily. There were no more pretenses between them. She had stopped wearing the housekeeper's uniform and now wore casual but elegant clothes that David had brought from the best boutiques in Boston. They had breakfast together in the main dining room, talked in the afternoons in the library, and slowly, very slowly, Emily began to remember what it was like to be seen as a woman, not as a ghost. One June morning, while they were drinking coffee on the terrace overlooking the gardens, where the azaleas bloomed in cascades of magenta, David asked her a question he had been avoiding for weeks. What really happened in Operation Midnight Storm? Emily felt the familiar knot in her stomach that always accompanied the memories of that night. She had spent 3 years avoiding thinking about the details, burying the trauma so deep that she could sometimes pretend it had been a terrible dream. "I'm not sure I'm ready to talk about it," she admitted, her hands trembling slightly around the porcelain cup. David reached out and covered her fingers with the warmth of his palm. "You don't have to if you don't want to, but I want you to know you can trust me with anything, no matter how dark it is." Emily looked out at the gardens, where Mr. Roberts was pruning roses with the patience of someone who had dedicated his life to growing beautiful things. There was something comforting in that image of normalcy, of life continuing despite the chaos. It was an operation to dismantle a cartel cell that was trafficking weapons across the Canadian border, she began slowly. "We had been following these guys for months. We knew their routes, their contacts, their schedules. Everything was perfectly planned." She paused, taking a sip of coffee that tasted bitter despite the sugar she had added. "There were 5 of us. Me as unit commander, Sergeant Williams, Corporals Johnson and Torres, and Private Jones. Jones was only 19. It was his first major operation, and he was so nervous he threw up 3 times before we left." David said nothing, but he squeezed her hand gently, encouraging her to continue. "We got to the meeting point at 11:30 p.m. Everything seemed normal. Too normal, I should have known. But I was so focused on the mission's success that I ignored my gut. When we approached the warehouse where the arms shipment was supposed to be, the lights suddenly came on. We were surrounded." Her voice broke slightly, and David moved closer to her in his chair. "It wasn't just cartel members. There were army elements too. Soldiers I recognized who had trained with us. That's when I knew we had been sold out. What did you do? What I had been trained to do. I yelled the order to retreat, and we started fighting our way out of there. But we were outnumbered 10-1. Williams was the first to fall, then Johnson. Torres managed to get to the truck, but a sniper's bullet— She couldn't finish the sentence. The tears she had been holding back finally began to flow down her cheeks. Jones and I made it to the trees. I thought we had succeeded, but he was wounded, losing a lot of blood. He told me to leave him, to save my own life. He was 19, David. His mother had sent him off that morning with a kiss on his forehead and a promise that he'd be home for his birthday. David got up from his chair and knelt beside her, taking her face in his hands as the tears continued to flow. "So you couldn't save him," he said softly. "That wasn't your fault." "But I tried," she whispered. "My God, how I tried. I carried him for 2 miles until we found a rural clinic, but it was too late. He died in my arms while I promised him his mother would know he was a hero. And then what happened? Miller showed up with a rescue team 2 hours later. He said it had been an operation that went wrong, that we had met unexpected resistance. But I knew the truth. Someone had sold us out, and that someone had to be in the highest levels of command. Is that why you faked your death?" Emily nodded, wiping her tears with the back of her hand. "Miller offered me protection if I kept my mouth shut about what really happened. When I refused, the threats started. Subtle at first, then more direct. They found planted drugs in my locker. Classified documents appeared in my room. They were setting me up for a court-martial that would have ended my career and probably my life. How did you manage to escape?" "With help," she admitted. "There were other people in the army who knew something wasn't right. General Thompson, your uncle, was one of them. He helped me fake my death and got me documents to start a new life." David was silent for a moment, processing all the information. "Is that why you're here, in my house? Did my uncle send you here?" Emily looked at him in surprise. "Didn't you know?" "I knew he had helped with the investigation into Miller, but I didn't know he had been involved in your rescue. How long have you been under his protection?" "Since the beginning. The identity of Alison Miller, the job here, it was all arranged by him." "I thought you knew." David stood up and began pacing the terrace, his mind working quickly. "That means my uncle has been planning this for 3 years. The investigation into Miller, putting you under my protection without my knowing it, waiting for the right moment to act." "Are you angry?" Emily asked in a small voice. David stopped and looked at her with an intensity that made her hold her breath. "Angry? Why would I be angry that destiny, with a little help from my uncle, brought me the most extraordinary woman I've ever met?" Before Emily could answer, Martha appeared on the terrace with a worried expression. "Excuse me, but there's a call for Miss Emily. She says it's from General Thompson and that it's urgent." David and Emily exchanged glances. After 3 years of silence, the general was finally making direct contact. "I'll take it in the study," David said. "Emily, I think it's time you knew the whole truth." The call was brief but revealing. General Thompson, with his grave, authoritative voice, informed them that the investigation into military corruption had finally borne fruit. They had solid evidence against Miller and his network, but they needed Emily's testimony to close the case for good. "Does that mean I'm free?" she asked, after David hung up the phone. "It means you can reclaim your life," he replied. "But it also means you'll have to testify at a court-martial. It will be dangerous." Emily was silent for a moment, contemplating the weight of the decision she had to make. On one hand, testifying meant justice for her fallen comrades. On the other, it meant publicly exposing herself and risking the new life she had built. "What do you think I should do?" she asked. "I think you already know what you have to do," David replied softly. "The woman I fell in love with isn't someone who runs from justice, no matter the personal cost." That afternoon, while they were walking through the gardens where they had spent so many hours in recent months, Emily made the decision that would change everything. "I'm going to testify," she announced. "My comrades deserve justice and I can't keep living in fear." David stopped under the jacaranda tree where they had shared their first kiss, its purple flowers creating a delicate carpet at their feet. "And after? What happens after the trial?" It was the question she had been avoiding asking herself. What would she do with her life once Miller was in prison? Would she return to the army? Would she start a civilian career? Where did David fit into those plans? "I don't know," she admitted. "For the first time in 3 years, I have real options." It's terrifying and exciting at the same time. David took her hands, turning her to face him completely. "Emily, there's something I've been wanting to ask you for weeks, but I didn't know if it was the right time. After everything you've been through, after everything you still have to face, I don't know if I have the right to ask you this." Emily's heart began to beat faster. There was something in his voice, in the way he was looking at her, that told her this was a moment she would remember for the rest of her life. "What do you want to ask me?" David took a deep breath, as if he were gathering courage for something he had been planning for a long time. "I want to ask you if you would consider staying, not just until after the trial, but permanently. I want to ask you if you think you could be happy building a life here with me." The world seemed to stop. The sounds of the garden, the murmur of the fountain, the singing of the birds, the rustling of the wind in the leaves faded until the only thing Emily could hear was the beating of her own heart. "David, I don't know if I can be what you need. I have so much baggage, so many scars." "Everyone has scars," he interrupted softly. "Yours are just more visible than mine. But that doesn't make them any less beautiful, and it doesn't make you any less worthy of love." Before Emily could reply, the sound of approaching vehicles interrupted the moment. But this time it wasn't a threat. It was General Thompson, arriving in person to finalize the preparations for the trial. As they watched the military convoy approach, Emily realized she had reached a turning point. The next few days would determine not only Miller's fate, but her own. "No matter what happens," she said, squeezing David's hand, "I want you to know that these months with you have been the happiest of my life in years." "This isn't goodbye," he replied firmly. "It's just the beginning." But as they headed into the house to greet the general, neither of them noticed the figure watching them from the bushes on the other side of the garden. Jack Thompson had been listening to every word, and he was already dialing a number on his cell phone. The final game was about to begin. Chapter 5. General Thomas Thompson was a man who commanded respect from the moment he entered a room. At 58, his completely grey hair and impeccable military posture spoke of decades of dedicated service to his country. But it was his eyes, the same intense blue as David's, that immediately revealed the family resemblance. The meeting took place in the mansion's library, where the three of them sat around the antique mahogany table that had belonged to David's ancestors. The curtains had been closed, and anti-espionage devices had been activated, creating an atmosphere of maximum confidentiality. "Emily," the general began, his voice grave but warm, "I want you to know that for these 3 years, I never stopped working to find the truth about what happened that night." "Why?" she asked. "Why did you risk so much for a simple lieutenant?" The general exchanged a meaningful glance with David before replying, "Because you weren't a simple lieutenant. You were the daughter of Colonel Robert Morales, one of the most honorable men I've ever known in my military career." Emily felt as if the air had been sucked out of the room. Her father had died when she was 12, in what she had been told was a military training accident. "My father—" "You knew him. Robert was my best friend," the general admitted. "We served together for 15 years. When he died, I promised your mother I would look out for you. When she passed away and you enlisted in the army, I followed your career closely." David watched the exchange with growing understanding. The pieces of a puzzle he had been trying to solve for months were finally beginning to fit together. "Uncle," he said slowly, "there's something more, isn't there?" The general sighed deeply, like a man who had been carrying a terrible weight for too long. "David, Emily, what I'm about to tell you must stay in this room until the trial is over. The truth about Operation Midnight Storm is much more complex than you can imagine." He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the gardens where the last lights of dusk painted everything in gold and scarlet. The operation wasn't just to dismantle an arms trafficking network, it was a trap. But not for Emily and her team, it was a trap for Miller. "What?" Emily stood up, her voice full of disbelief. "Are you saying my comrades died as collateral damage in an operation against Miller?" "No," the general replied firmly. "I'm saying Miller was smarter than we thought. He discovered our operation and turned it against us. What was supposed to be his capture turned into a massacre." David felt something cold settle in his stomach. What exactly was the original plan? We had been investigating Miller for months. We knew he was selling military information to the cartel, but we needed solid evidence. The plan was to use Operation Midnight Storm as bait. Miller would pass the information about the mission to the cartel, as he always did, but we would be ready to catch him in the act. Emily sank into her chair, the magnitude of the revelation hitting her like a wave. But he realized the trap. More than that, the general continued. He turned the trap into his own operation. Instead of just selling the information, he organized a full-scale ambush. His plan was to eliminate the entire team and then show up as the hero who arrived too late to save them. "Except I survived," Emily murmured. "Except you survived. And that completely ruined his plan. That's why he's been so desperate to find you all these years. You're the only witness who can completely destroy him." David stood up abruptly, beginning to pace the library. "There's something else," he said. "Something you still haven't told us." The general looked at him with appreciation. "You were always too smart for your own good. Yes, there's something else." He went to his briefcase and pulled out a thick manila folder. The connection between Miller and the cartel wasn't just professional, it was personal. His eldest son, John Miller, didn't die in a car accident 5 years ago as the newspapers reported. He was executed by the cartel when a military operation interfered with their business. Emily felt the pieces finally starting to fit together in the most horrible way possible. Miller started working for the cartel after his son's death. Not just working for them, the general corrected. He became their most valuable operative inside the army. Every failed operation, every compromised intelligence, every soldier who died in unexpected ambushes, it all bore Miller's signature. David stopped in front of the window, his hands clenched into fists. How many soldiers died because of his betrayal? In the last 5 years, 37 confirmed, probably more than we'll ever know. The silence that followed was deafening. Emily felt the room spin slightly. 37 soldiers, 37 families destroyed. And she had been running from facing the man responsible for 3 years. "General," she finally said, her voice firm despite the emotions running through her, "when does the trial begin?" "In a week. But Emily, I need you to understand the risks. Miller has deep connections, not just in the army but in the civilian government too. Testifying against him will make you a permanent target." "I'm already a target," she replied simply. "At least now I can do something useful with that situation." David turned to her, admiration and terror mixing in his expression. "Emily, you don't have to do this. We can find another way. We can—" "No," she interrupted. "There is no other way. My comrades deserve justice. The other 37 soldiers deserve justice. And the families who have suffered for years without knowing the truth deserve answers." The general watched the exchange between his nephew and the woman he had been protecting for 3 years, and a small but significant smile crossed his face. "There's one more thing you need to know," he said. "Once the trial begins, once Emily testifies, there will be no turning back. Miller will play all his cards, including some we probably haven't anticipated." "What do you mean?" David asked. "I mean, it's very likely he'll try to eliminate Emily before she can testify. And it's also likely he'll try to use any personal connection she has as leverage." The general's eyes fixed on David with clear meaning. "In other words, David, your relationship with Emily automatically makes you a target too." David walked over to Emily and took her hand firmly. "Then we'll face that together too." "David, you can't—" "Yes, I can," he interrupted. "And I will. I'm not going to let you face this alone." The general watched the couple for a moment, then nodded in approval. "Very well, but then we need to talk about extreme security measures. As of tomorrow, this mansion will essentially become a fortified military base." For the next 2 hours, they discussed security plans, emergency protocols, and the legal details of Emily's testimony. When the general finally prepared to leave, he pulled David aside for a private conversation. "Nephew, I want you to understand what's at stake here. It's not just Emily's life. It's not just justice for fallen soldiers. If Miller falls, his entire network crumbles. We're talking about cleaning up decades of military corruption." "I understand," David replied. "Why do I feel like there's something else you haven't told me?" The general hesitated for a moment. "Because there is. Miller isn't just a corrupt colonel, David. He's the son of one of the most powerful men in the country. His father is Senator Miller, chairman of the National Defense Commission." David felt the ground open up under his feet. Senator Miller was practically untouchable, a man with connections that reached all the way to the White House. "Are you saying we're facing not just a corrupt colonel, but an entire political dynasty?" "Exactly. And that, nephew, is why I needed Emily to have the protection of our family before this came to light." When the general left, David returned to the library where Emily was sitting in the same place, looking out the window at the darkness that had fallen over the gardens. "Do you regret getting involved in this?" she asked without looking at him. David sat down next to her, taking her cold hand in his. "The only thing I regret is not having found you sooner. The last 3 years you've been alone, facing this with no one by your side." Emily finally looked at him, and he saw tears shining in her green eyes. "David, once this trial begins, our lives will never be normal again. There will always be threats. There will always be danger." "Is that really what you want?" David moved closer to her, framing her face with his hands. "Emily, I've spent my whole adult life feeling like something was missing. I had money, success, everything that's supposed to make you happy, but I never felt complete until I met you. If the price of having you in my life is facing some powerful enemies, then it's a price I'm willing to pay. What if you regret it? What if in 5 years you decide it was too complicated? Then I guess you'll have to trust me when I tell you that's never going to happen." They kissed then, a kiss that tasted of promises and an uncertain future, of difficult decisions and love that had grown in the most improbable of circumstances. But as they lost themselves in that moment of intimacy, neither of them saw the small red light blinking from a device hidden among the books on the highest shelf. Jack Thompson had been busy during the meeting with the general, and now he had recordings of every word that had been said in that room. Miller would have that information before dawn. Chapter 6. The dawn of the trial day arrived with a deceptive serenity. The gardens of the Thompson mansion were covered by a light morning mist that made the flowers look like soft-colored ghosts floating in a dream world. But the reality was much harsher. Military snipers occupied strategic positions among the trees, armored vehicles were parked discreetly behind the property's walls, and a full team of special forces had turned the mansion into an impenetrable fortress. Emily woke up before dawn as she had done during her years of military service, but this time she didn't wake up alone. David had insisted on staying with her that night, not for romance, but for the simple human need not to be alone when facing life-defining moments. "Did you sleep at all?" he asked, noticing the dark circles under her green eyes. "A little," she lied, adjusting the silk robe he had given her. "You?" "Enough," he replied, although they both knew it had been a night of shared vigil, full of whispered conversations about possible futures and unexpressed fears. Breakfast was served in the room by Martha, who had insisted on personally preparing every dish, despite the extreme security measures that required all food to be checked by specialists before being consumed. "Honey," the cook said, with tears in her eyes as she placed a plate of steak and eggs in front of Emily, prepared exactly the way she liked them, "I want you to know that everyone in this house is proud of you. What you're doing today is what a real hero would do." Emily took Martha's wrinkled hand, feeling the weight of all the affection and support she had received from the people who had become her chosen family. "Thank you, Martha, for everything, for taking care of me, for accepting me, for treating me like a daughter when I needed it most." "You are my daughter," the woman replied firmly, "and mothers are always proud when their daughters do the right thing, no matter how hard it is." At 10 in the morning, the convoy that would transport Emily to the military courthouse was ready. 3 armored vehicles, 12 Special Forces soldiers, and a route plan that had been changed 3 times during the night to avoid possible ambushes. David would accompany her, despite General Thompson's objections about the additional risks. He had been unyielding on that point. Emily would not face this alone. As they prepared to leave, David handed her a small blue velvet box. "It's not what you think," he said quickly when he saw the surprise on her face. "Well, not exactly." Emily opened the box and found a delicate gold chain with a small medallion engraved with the words "Courage" on one side and "Hope" on the other. "My grandmother gave it to me when I joined the army," David explained. "She said it would protect me and remind me who I was, no matter where life took me. I want you to have it today." Emily felt tears prickling in her eyes as he placed the chain around her neck. "David, don't say anything now," he interrupted softly. "Just promise that when all this is over, we'll have the conversation we've been postponing." "What conversation?" "The conversation about the rest of our lives." The journey to the military courthouse in Washington, D.C. took 3 hours, during which Emily mentally reviewed her testimony again and again. She had spent weeks preparing with the military prosecutors, remembering every detail of that terrible night, organizing documents and evidence that had been hidden for years. But nothing had prepared her for the moment she saw Miller sitting at the defense table. The man who had haunted her nightmares for 3 years looked older, thinner, but his eyes retained that calculating coldness she remembered so well. When he saw her enter the courtroom, he smiled slightly, a gesture that was more threatening than any verbal threat. The trial began with opening statements. The military prosecutor, a severe-looking colonel named Henderson, presented a meticulous case detailing years of betrayal, corruption, and death. The defense, led by a team of civilian lawyers who had clearly cost a fortune, argued that Miller was a scapegoat, a victim of a political conspiracy to cover up systemic failures of the army. When it was time for Emily to take the stand, she felt every eye in the courtroom fix on her. In the public gallery, she could see families of the soldiers who had died because of Miller's betrayal. Their faces, full of pain and hope, gave her the strength she needed. "State your full name for the record," the prosecutor requested. "Lieutenant Emily Morales, U.S. Army Special Forces, Covert Operations Unit." "Lieutenant Morales, can you tell us what happened on the night of March 15, 3 years ago?" And so it began. For 4 hours, Emily recounted every detail of that night, from the mission's preparation to Jones's last moments in her arms. Her voice remained firm, professional, but no one in that room could avoid feeling the emotional weight of every word. When it was the turn of the cross-examination, Miller's lawyer tried to discredit her testimony, suggesting she had been traumatized, that her memory was unreliable, that she had personal motivations for lying. "Lieutenant Morales," the lawyer said in a condescending tone, "isn't it true that you deserted your post after the failed operation?" "No, sir," Emily replied firmly. "I faked my death to escape the threats of the accused." "Threats? Can you prove those threats existed?" Emily looked directly at Miller as she answered. "You can check the security recordings of the base. Colonel Miller visited me in my room 3 nights after the operation. He told me, and I quote literally, 'It would be a shame if you had an accident like the one Private Jones had.'" A murmur ran through the room. Miller's lawyer paled slightly. "Do you have any physical evidence of that conversation?" "I have this." Emily pulled out a small recording device she had been hiding in her uniform. "During my years in covert operations, I learned to never meet with potentially hostile sources without backup. That night, for the first time in my career, I considered Colonel Miller a potentially hostile source." The prosecutor smiled as he received the device. That recording had not been part of the previously submitted evidence. It had been Emily's ace in the hole. When the recording was played in the courtroom, Miller's clear voice threatening her echoed in the total silence. Emily saw the exact moment the defense lawyer realized his case had fallen apart, but Miller wasn't done playing his cards. "Lieutenant Morales!" he shouted from his seat, ignoring his lawyer's attempts to silence him. "You want justice? Then let's talk about justice. Do you know how your father really died?" The world stopped. Emily felt as if she had been hit physically. "My father died in a training accident." "Your father died because he discovered I was selling military information. Do you want to know who killed him?" "Objection!" the prosecutor shouted, but Miller continued. "General Thompson, your precious protector killed your father to protect the operation that would lead them all to a fortune." Chaos erupted in the courtroom. The judges yelled for order, the lawyers rose from their seats, and Emily felt the world spinning around her. But through the chaos, she saw David get up from his seat in the gallery, his blue eyes fixed on her with an intensity that calmed her. It didn't matter what Miller said. It didn't matter what new horrors came to light. David would be there. "That's a lie!" she shouted, her voice cutting through the noise. "My father was his friend. You're desperate. Ask the general," Miller retorted, as guards approached to control him. "Ask him why your father really had to die." The judges ordered an emergency recess. As Emily was escorted out of the courtroom, her mind worked frantically. Was it possible? Could there be any truth to Miller's accusations? David found her in a private room where she had been taken to recover from the shock. "Emily, look at me," he said, taking her face in his hands. "Whatever happened with your father, whatever the truth is, that doesn't change who you are. It doesn't change how you feel about me or how I feel about you." "What if it's true?" she whispered. "What if your uncle killed my father? Then we'll face that truth together," he replied without hesitation. "But we're not going to let Miller destroy what we've built with desperate lies." General Thompson arrived 30 minutes later, his face gray and aged. He sat down across from Emily and David, and for the first time since they had known him, he seemed truly defeated. "Emily," he began in a broken voice, "there are things about your father's death that I never wanted you to know." Emily felt her heart stop. "Your father didn't die in a training accident. He died because he discovered Miller was selling military information, but I wasn't the one who killed him." "Then who?" "It was Miller, but I was there. I could have saved him, and I didn't." The silence that followed was dense as smoke. "Your father had discovered the corruption network. He had evidence that would have destroyed Miller and all his accomplices. That night, Miller confronted him in the arms warehouse. I had followed your father because I suspected something was going on." Tears began to run down the general's cheeks. "When I arrived, I saw Miller pointing a gun at your father. I had 2 options: intervene and likely both die, or hide and gather evidence to destroy Miller later. You chose to hide," Emily said, her voice empty of emotion. "I chose to be a coward. I watched Miller shoot my best friend, and I did nothing. Then I helped cover up the murder as a training accident so I could build a long-term case against him. And that long-term case included using his daughter as bait?" David's voice was cold as ice. "No," the general replied firmly. "When Emily enlisted, I tried to keep her away from anything related to Miller, but when Operation Midnight Storm went wrong, I knew I had to protect her. It was the least I could do for the daughter of the man I couldn't save." Emily slowly stood up, walking toward the window that overlooked the military courthouse's courtyard. "For 15 years I've been living with the guilt," the general continued. "For 15 years I've been trying to find a way to honor your father's memory by destroying the man who killed him. And you were willing to sacrifice me to get it?" "No, never." Everything I've done for these 3 years has been to keep you safe while I built the perfect case against Miller." Emily turned to him, her green eyes shining with unshed tears. "General, I understand why you did what you did. I understand the weight of guilt, the need for justice, but I can't forgive you for lying to me all these years." "I didn't expect you to," he replied softly, "but I can finish what my father started. I can make sure Miller pays for all his crimes, including the murder of Robert Morales." David walked over to her, taking her hand. "Are you sure? After everything you've just learned, do you still want to continue?" Emily looked toward the courtroom where Miller was waiting, where the families of dead soldiers were waiting for justice, where her own past could finally find peace. "More than ever," she replied in a firm voice. "But this time I'm doing it for my father, for my fallen comrades, and for us, for the future we deserve to have together." The trial resumed 2 hours later. This time, when Emily took the stand, she wasn't just the survivor of Operation Midnight Storm. She was the daughter of Robert Morales, seeking justice for a crime that had been hidden for 15 years. Her testimony about the events of that terrible night 3 years ago was devastating. But when she presented additional evidence she had been holding on to, photographs, documents, recordings her father had hidden before he died, the case against Miller became irrefutable. When the guilty verdict was read 3 days later, Emily felt a weight she had been carrying for years finally lift from her shoulders. Miller was sentenced to life in prison for treason, murder, and corruption. His network was dismantled, and dozens of other corrupt officials were arrested. But more important to Emily was what happened after the trial. David was waiting for her on the courthouse steps, with a smile that lit up his entire face. "How does justice feel?" he asked, as he took her in his arms. "It feels like freedom," she replied. "For the first time in years, I feel free. Free enough for that conversation we've been postponing." Emily laughed, a sound that was pure joy. "Here? On the steps of a military courthouse?" "Here at home in Paris on the moon," he replied. "I don't care where, only that it's with you." They kissed then, surrounded by reporters and cameras, but feeling as if they were completely alone in the world. It was a kiss that tasted of a future, of promises fulfilled, of love that had survived the unthinkable. 6 months later, in a small, intimate ceremony in the gardens of the Thompson mansion, Emily Morales became Emily Thompson. The wedding was officiated by a military chaplain, with Martha Jones as maid of honor, and General Thompson, who had found his own form of redemption by helping to reform the military system, walking Emily down the aisle. David had kept his promise to love her both as Allison, the silent housekeeper, and as Emily, the brave soldier. And she had learned that true love didn't require her to be perfect or without scars. It only required her to be honest about who she really was. On their wedding night, as they danced slowly on the terrace under the Boston stars, David whispered in her ear, "Do you regret anything?" Emily thought of everything she had lost, everything she had gained, all the paths that had led her to this moment. "Only one thing," she replied, "waiting so long to trust that I deserve to be loved." "Good," he said, twirling her under the moonlight, "because I plan on spending the rest of my life making sure you never forget how much you're worth." And as the city lights twinkled in the distance and the scent of lilies filled the night air, Emily finally understood what her mother had tried to teach her so many years ago, that no matter how far life takes you, no matter how many times you have to start over, you should never forget who you are in your heart. She was Emily Thompson now, but she was still the same woman who had risked everything to do the right thing, who had loved with all the intensity of her brave heart, and who had learned that sometimes the best love stories begin when you think your story has ended. In the distance, the New England mountains rose against the starry sky, silent guardians of a land that had seen countless stories of pain transformed into hope, of broken hearts that found a way to beat again, of love that grew in the most unexpected places. And in that brownstone mansion, surrounded by gardens where flowers were reborn each season, no matter how harsh the previous drought had been, two people who had been lost had finally found each other. Not just each other, but themselves.